"Sir, this room is for operators, not visitors." The words snapped across the briefing room like a ruler against steel, sharp, practiced, and just loud enough for everyone to hear, and the low hum of conversation died in an instant as Sergeant Kyle Mercer stood squared in front of the door, blocking the old man's path with the confidence of someone who had never once been told he was wrong. Behind him, a dozen young operators in crisp uniforms leaned back against tables cluttered with tablets, digital maps, and steaming mugs of coffee, their eyes flicking between the confrontation and the glowing screens that painted the room in a cold blue light. The old man didn't argue, didn't even flinch. He just stood there, boots dusty, jacket worn thin at the cuffs, holding a folded paper map like it still meant something in a room ruled by satellites and software. His eyes, pale and steady, moved past Mercer as if the younger man wasn't even there, scanning the walls, the screens, the layout, taking it all in with a quiet patience that felt out of place in a room built on speed and precision. Mercer let out a short breath through his nose, the kind that carried a smirk without needing to show it. "You're in the wrong place, sir," he added, softer now but heavier, like a verdict already made, and a couple of the team members chuckled under their breath, the sound dry, dismissive, easy. The old man shifted the map slightly in his hand, the paper crackling faintly in the silence. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, gravelly, worn by time but steady as a fixed bearing. "You're choosing the wrong extraction route." And just like that, something in the room paused, not stopped. Not yet, just a slight hesitation, like a missed step on gravel. Mercer blinked once, then let out a short laugh, turning halfway back to his team as if to share the joke. "That's so," he said, glancing at the nearest screen where a clean digital grid showed wind data, elevation, thermal patterns, all neatly calculated down to the yard. "We've got live satellite feed, terrain modeling, and real-time weather updates. But sure, we'll take advice from a paper map." More laughter this time, louder, easier, the kind that fills space quickly and leaves nothing behind. The old man didn't react, didn't defend himself. He just watched the screen, his eyes narrowing slightly as if something there didn't sit right. And for a brief second, the room felt smaller, tighter, like the air had shifted without anyone noticing. Mercer turned back, stepping closer now, close enough to see the fine lines in the old man's face, the kind carved by years, not age. "Who sent you?" he asked, the edge returning to his voice, and the old man met his gaze without effort. "Colonel Harrington," he said simply, and that should have meant something. It should have carried weight, but Mercer only tilted his head, unimpressed. "Right," he replied, dragging the word out just enough to strip it of meaning, and somewhere in the back of the room, a young private, Ryan Cole, stopped smiling, his eyes flicking from the map to the old man's face, then back again. A small knot forming in his chest he couldn't explain. Not yet, but it was there, and it wasn't going away. The room did not recover its rhythm after that. Not completely, because the old man did not move away and Mercer did not step aside, and between them hung a silence that felt heavier than it should have, like pressure building before a storm that no one had checked for. Mercer exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders as if resetting the moment back into something he understood, then gestured toward the largest screen where the Redstone Valley simulation rotated in clean digital layers, every ridge and ravine mapped down to the foot. "We have already run this scenario 6 times, he said, his voice controlled again, professional, the tone of a man returning to ground he trusted. Every variable accounted for. Wind shift at 15 miles per hour, thermal drift from the canyon walls, extraction window at 0500. We are not guessing here." A few heads nodded around the room, confidence returning in small increments, reinforced by numbers and data and the quiet glow of machines that never doubted themselves. The old man stepped forward just enough to see the screen clearly, the paper map still in his hand, edges worn, creases deep from years of folding and unfolding. And for a moment he did not speak. He just watched, eyes tracking the simulated route as it cut cleanly through the valley. Precise, efficient, and completely wrong. "Your exit collapses here," he said at last, lifting one finger toward the lower ridge line, not touching the screen, just hovering there, as if he already knew where the weakness was without needing to confirm it. Wind will push you into the ravine before you even see it. Mercer gave a short, disbelieving laugh, sharper this time, less amused. That is not what the data says, he replied, tapping the tablet in his hand. The model shows stable crosswind, no downdraft strong enough to. The model does not feel the ground. The old man interrupted, not louder, but firmer, the words landing with a weight that did not belong to theory. And that was when Mercer's patience finally thinned, just enough to show. And you do? He asked, stepping closer, close enough now that the room could feel the challenge in the air. Because last time I checked, we stopped relying on guesswork a long time ago. The old man looked at him then, really looked, and there was no anger in his expression, no need to push back, just a quiet certainty that did not shift. You did not stop relying on anything, he said. You just forgot how to see it. The words did not echo, they did not need to. They settled into the room like dust after a long movement, subtle but impossible to ignore. Somewhere behind Mercer, Ryan Cole swallowed, his gaze drifting again to the map in the old man's hand, to the faint markings that did not match anything on their screens, and then to the ridge line being discussed. And for a second the two images overlapped in his mind in a way that made him uneasy, like seeing a reflection that did not line up with the object casting it. Mercer noticed the shift in attention and moved quickly to regain control, reaching out and taking the paper map from the old man's hand with a casual, dismissive motion, holding it up between two fingers as if it weighed nothing. This, he said, turning it slightly so the others could see the faded lines and handwritten markings. This is what you are basing it on. A few quiet chuckles followed, softer now, uncertain, and as the map unfolded, a small section near the center caught the light, a marking darker than the rest, older, deliberate, the words barely visible but still there, etched into the paper like something that had never been meant to fade, and Ryan's breath caught in his throat as he leaned forward just enough to read it. The letters forming slowly in his mind are AVEN, and something about that name did not feel like a joke at all. The letters sat there on the worn paper like they had been waiting to be seen, not printed clean like the digital overlays behind them, but carved in by hand, deliberate, permanent, and Ryan Cole felt a slow, uneasy weight settle in his chest as his eyes traced them again. Raven line, not a label, not a guess, something older, something that had been decided long before any of them had ever touched a console. Mercer did not notice at first. He was still holding the map up like a prop, turning it slightly as if the angle might make it any more credible. You see this, he said to the room, voice carrying again, trying to pull the momentum back under his control. Handwritten routes, no coordinates, no elevation markers, no data validation. This is exactly why we moved past this kind of thinking. A few heads nodded, but slower now, less certain, because the room had shifted in a way that was hard to explain, like something unseen had entered and taken up space. The old man did not reach for the map, did not try to take it back. He simply watched Mercer with that same steady gaze, patient, unmoved, as if the outcome of this moment had already been decided somewhere far beyond the walls of the room. Ryan stepped closer without realizing it, drawn in by something he could not quite name, his voice low when he finally spoke, almost careful. Where did you get that marking? The question cut across Mercer's explanation just enough to break its rhythm, and Mercer glanced over, irritation flickering across his face. From him, he replied, giving the map a slight shake as if that answered everything. Why? Ryan hesitated, his mind reaching back, searching through fragments of memory that had never mattered until now. Images of a photograph in Colonel Harrington's office, a frame sitting slightly off-center on a shelf, a faded terrain sketch pinned behind glass, and on it, a line marked in dark ink with a single word written beside it. Raven. He had seen it more than once, never asked about it, never needed to, until now. I have seen that before, Ryan said, a little louder this time, enough for the room to hear, and that drew attention in a way Mercer did not like, his posture tightening slightly as he turned fully toward the younger man. Seen what? He asked, the edge returning, sharper now. A random word on an old piece of paper? Ryan shook his head slowly, eyes still locked on the map. Not random, he said. Colonel Harrington has it in his office, same marking, same line. The words landed differently, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy in a way that numbers and screens were not. And for the first time, Mercer did not immediately respond, his grip on the map tightening just slightly as he looked down at it again. Really looked this time, as if seeing it for the first time instead of dismissing it. The room quieted again, but this silence was not empty. It was filled with something building, something shifting beneath the surface, and the old man finally moved, one small step forward, close enough now that the light from the screens caught the edges of his face, deepening the lines, sharpening the stillness in his eyes. That route is not a suggestion, he said, voice calm, steady. It is the only way out of that valley when everything else fails. Mercer let out a breath, slower this time, less certain. His confidence no longer clean and solid but fractured at the edges. And you know that how? He asked, the question hanging there, no longer rhetorical, no longer safe, and the old man held his gaze for a long second before answering. Because I was there when it was drawn, and that was the moment the room stopped pretending this was just a misunderstanding. For a moment, no one moved. Not Mercer, not Ryan, not the rest of the team, because the weight of those words did not land like a challenge. It landed like a memory that did not belong to them, something already finished long before they ever arrived. Mercer's jaw tightened slightly, the last trace of his earlier confidence shifting into something harder to hold, something that required effort. You are saying you drew this? He asked, his tone measured now, controlled, but no longer dismissive, and the old man did not nod, did not dramatize it. He simply held Mercer's gaze and answered, I was part of the team that found it. And that subtle difference, that refusal to take full credit, only made the statement heavier. The room seemed to narrow around them, the soft hum of equipment suddenly louder in the silence, the glow of the screens colder, less certain, and Ryan could feel it clearly now, that something he had not understood before was unfolding in real time, something the data on those screens could not explain. Mercer glanced down at the map again, slower this time, his eyes tracing the Raven line as if expecting it to change under scrutiny, but it did not. It held its shape, steady, stubborn, like it had survived being doubted before. We have run the terrain models, Mercer said, almost to himself now. Less a statement, more a defense. There is no indication of a safe passage through that section. The old man shifted slightly, just enough for the light to catch the edge of the map, highlighting the faint contour lines drawn by hand. Because you are looking at it from above, he said, not from inside it. And that distinction, simple as it sounded, seemed to fracture the logic the room had been built on. One of the operators near the back leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the screen, adjusting the view, rotating the valley, zooming in, but the digital terrain remained clean, perfect, and incomplete. Mercer exhaled slowly, running a hand across the back of his neck, the gesture small but telling. So what? There is a hidden path that satellites cannot see, he asked, not mocking. Now, but not fully convinced either, and the old man's expression did not change. Not hidden, he replied. Just forgotten. The word lingered, heavier than the others, because it implied something. Worse than error, it implied loss. Ryan felt his pulse pick up slightly, his mind racing ahead of the moment, connecting things he had not connected before, the photograph in the colonel's office, the marking, the way it had been placed not as decoration but as something preserved, something remembered, and without thinking further, he stepped back, pulling his phone from his pocket, his fingers moving faster than his certainty, because some part of him understood that whatever this was, it had already moved beyond them. Mercer noticed the movement immediately, his eyes snapping toward Ryan. What are you doing? He asked, sharper again, trying to pull control back into his hands. But Ryan did not answer right away, his focus on the screen as the call connected, each ring stretching the silence tighter. And in that space, the old man remained still, unbothered, as if this was the part he had been waiting for all along. When the line finally clicked, Ryan's voice dropped, respectful. Without trying, Sir, this is Private Cole. I am in the briefing room. There is someone here. His name is Thomas Whitaker. He paused, glancing at the map, at the Raven line, at Mercer standing rigid across from it. And he is saying something about a route called Raven Line. The response on the other end was not loud, not dramatic, but it was immediate, and whatever was said, It drained the color from Ryan's face in a way no simulation ever had, because he looked up slowly, meeting Mercer's eyes, and for the first time since this began, there was no uncertainty left in his voice at all. Ryan lowered the phone slowly, but his grip did not relax, his knuckles pale against the dark casing as the silence in the room shifted again, no longer uncertain but tightening, drawing inward like something bracing for impact. Mercer watched him closely, reading the change before any words were spoken. "What did they say?" he asked, his voice controlled but edged now. The authority still there, but no longer absolute. And Ryan swallowed once before answering, choosing his words carefully. "They told me to stay where I am, and not to let him leave." The last part landed heavier than anything that had been said so far, not because it was loud, but because it carried instruction, and instruction meant recognition. Mercer's eyes flicked to the old man, then back to Ryan, searching for hesitation, for doubt, for anything that would let him dismiss this. But there was none, only a quiet certainty that had not been there before. The room felt smaller now, the walls closer, the hum of the equipment sharper against the silence. And one by one, the operators who had laughed earlier began to shift. Their weight, their attention no longer on the screens but on the man standing at the center of it all. Thomas Whitaker did not move, did not react to the change. He simply stood there, the same as before, as if none of this altered anything about him at all, and that steadiness made the shift around him even more pronounced. Mercer drew a slow breath, trying to reassemble control from pieces that no longer fit together cleanly. "That does not mean anything," he said, though the words lacked the certainty they once carried. "It just means someone up the chain wants to verify." But even as he said it, his eyes dropped once more to the map still in his hand, to the Raven line that now seemed less like a relic and more like a question he could not answer. Ryan shook his head slightly, his voice quieter but firmer. "No, sir. It means they already know who he is." And that was the moment the room crossed a line it could not step back from. A faint sound echoed from the hallway outside, distant at first, then clearer, the sharp cadence of boots moving with purpose, not hurried, not chaotic, but deliberate, measured, and unmistakably directed. Mercer heard it too, his posture stiffening, his attention pulled toward the door as if drawn by instinct, the kind that responded to authority before thought could catch up. The others followed, heads turning, conversations dying before they could form, because something about that sound carried weight, the kind that did not need explanation. Thomas did not look toward the door, did not shift his stance. He only glanced once at the screen, at the valley still displayed in perfect digital clarity, then back to Mercer, as if reminding him, without words, that the problem had never changed. The footsteps stopped just outside, a brief pause settling over everything like a held breath, and in that pause, Mercer felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not fear, not exactly, but the sharp awareness that the ground beneath him was no longer solid in the way he had believed. Ryan straightened slightly, instinct taking over, his phone lowering to his side, his attention fixed forward, because whatever was about to happen next was no longer a question. The handle turned with a quiet click, and the door began to open, slow, controlled, and every eye in the room shifted toward it at once, the moment stretching just long enough to make it clear that nothing after this would be the same. The door opened without force, without urgency, just a controlled motion that carried more authority than any raised voice in the room. And Colonel Daniel Harrington stepped inside with the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself. His uniform crisp, his gaze sharp, and the air shifted immediately, as if the room itself had adjusted to accommodate him. Every operator straightened instinctively, chairs nudging back against the floor, shoulders tightening into formality. But the Colonel did not acknowledge them at first, his eyes moving past Mercer, past the screens, landing directly on the old man standing at the center of it all. For a brief second, something changed in his expression, not visible to everyone, but enough to register to those paying attention. A flicker of recognition that replaced the usual command distance with something far more personal. Mercer stepped forward quickly, regaining posture, voice firm. "Sir, we have a situation," he began, but the Colonel raised one hand slightly, not abrupt, not dismissive, just enough to stop the words before they fully formed. and the silence that followed was immediate and absolute. The colonel took 2 measured steps closer, his boots steady against the floor, his eyes never leaving the old man. And when he spoke, his voice was lower than Mercer's had been, but it carried across the room with unmistakable weight. "Thomas Whitaker," he said. Not as a question, not as a guess, but as confirmation. The name settled into the room like something heavy being placed down, and Mercer felt it before he understood it. The shift of control leaving his hands completely. The old man met the colonel's gaze, unchanged, steady as before, and gave a slight nod. Nothing more, no introduction, no explanation, just acknowledgment. The colonel exhaled once, a controlled breath that seemed to carry years behind it. And then, without hesitation, he straightened fully and came to attention, the movement precise, deliberate, and unmistakable. The room froze, not metaphorically, not figuratively, but completely, because what they were seeing did not fit anything they had been taught to expect. A colonel standing at attention in front of a man in a worn jacket, holding a paper map. Ryan felt his pulse spike, his earlier uncertainty replaced by something far clearer now, something that did not need explanation. Mercer stood still, every instinct telling him to react, to correct, to restore order, but there was nothing left to correct, nothing left to control, only the realization that he had misread the entire situation from the beginning. The colonel lowered his posture slowly, but his respect did not fade with the movement. It remained in the way he stood, in the way he looked at Thomas. "Sir," he said quietly, the single word carrying more weight than any briefing. "We have been trying to solve this valley for 3 days." His eyes flicked briefly to the screen, to the clean digital map that suddenly felt incomplete, and we have not been able to find a reliable extraction. Thomas shifted his gaze to the display once more, then back to the colonel. "You are looking at it from the wrong side," he replied, calm as ever, and the colonel gave a slight nod, as if that answer alone confirmed everything he needed to know. Behind them, Mercer's grip on the map loosened just enough for the paper to shift in his hand, the Raven line. Catching the light again, no longer a point of debate, no longer something to dismiss, but something real, something proven by the only person in the room who had actually stood where that line had been drawn. The colonel did not rush the moment. He did not fill the silence with explanation or authority. He let it sit there, heavy and undeniable, because some truths did not need to be spoken twice. And when he finally turned slightly toward the rest of the room, his gaze moved across each face with a calm precision that made every man there stand a little straighter without being told. "This route," he said, gesturing toward the screen and then toward the map still in Mercer's hand, "was not in your system because it was never meant to be." His voice was steady, measured, the kind that carried history without raising volume. It was drawn in a situation where maps stopped working and only experience remained. The words settled differently now, not as theory, not as debate, but as something final. Mercer swallowed once, the motion subtle but visible, his earlier certainty now replaced by the quiet realization that he had been standing on incomplete ground, and he shifted his weight slightly, looking down at the map again before carefully stepping forward and offering it back. Both hands this time. No trace of mockery left in the gesture. Thomas accepted it without ceremony, unfolding it with practiced ease, the paper moving like something familiar, something used countless times before, and he stepped closer to the screen, not asking permission, not needing it, because the authority in the room had already changed hands. The digital map glowed in front of him, precise and flawless, and yet it felt secondary now, like a reference instead of a guide. And Thomas raised his hand, placing a single finger just below the ridge line, not touching the screen, but aligning perfectly with the Raven line on the paper. "Your model reads the valley as a single system," he said, his voice calm, clear, "but it is not. It breaks here and here." He moved his finger slightly, tracing invisible points that did not exist on the digital overlay. The wind splits, one current rises along the rock face, the other drops through the cut, and if you follow the data, you will be pushed straight into it. No one interrupted, no one laughed, because there was nothing left to dismiss. One of the operators reached for the controls almost instinctively, adjusting the simulation, isolating the sections Thomas had indicated, And for the first time, the model hesitated, the clean lines flickering slightly as new variables were forced into it. Incomplete data trying to catch up with something it had never been designed to see. Ryan watched closely, his earlier uncertainty now replaced by a growing clarity. Each movement Thomas made aligning with something deeper than calculation, something that came from having stood inside that space rather than above it. The colonel remained just behind him, not directing, not correcting, simply observing with a quiet respect that did not need to be explained. And when Thomas finished tracing the route, he lowered his hand and looked back at the room. "If you want them out," he said, "this is the way you take." The statement was not forceful, not dramatic, but it carried the kind of certainty that made every other option feel incomplete. Mercer stood still for a second longer, then gave a short nod. "The movement small but decisive. Update the route," he said, his voice steady again, but changed, stripped of assumption, grounded in something he had not walked in with. And as the team moved to adjust the simulation, the room came back to life in a different way, quieter, sharper, focused not on proving anything, but on understanding it. And through it all, Thomas Whitaker remained exactly as he had been when he walked in, calm, still, and completely certain, as if none of this was new, as if he had simply returned to a place that had been waiting for someone to remember it. The updated simulation did not respond right away. Not like before when every input produced an immediate, confident result, because now the system was trying to process something it had never been asked to consider, and the clean lines of the valley began to shift in subtle ways, small distortions at first, barely noticeable unless someone was watching closely, but Ryan saw it. The way the airflow indicators flickered near the ridge, the way the projected path adjusted by a few feet, then a few more, as if the model itself was hesitating, recalculating, correcting something it had overlooked. One of the operators leaned closer to his screen, fingers moving quickly across the controls, isolating the sections Thomas had pointed out, feeding in micro-adjustments, terrain variations measured down to inches, and for the first time since the exercise began, the system produced a different outcome, not a failure, not a dead end, but a narrow path, unstable at first, then stabilizing as more data aligned with what had been drawn on that worn piece of paper. A quiet shift moved through the room, not spoken, not acknowledged, but felt, the kind that happens when certainty changes direction. Mercer watched the screen without speaking, his posture still, his attention locked on the evolving route, and when the final projection settled, showing a clean extraction path threading through the valley exactly where Thomas had indicated, he exhaled slowly. The sound almost lost in the hum of the equipment, but it carried something new, something closer to understanding than resistance. "Run it again," he said, not out of doubt, but out of discipline, and the team obeyed immediately, resetting the simulation, inputting the same adjustments, watching as the path formed again, consistent this time, reliable, repeatable, and real. No one laughed, no one questioned, because the evidence did not leave room for it. Thomas stood slightly back now, his map folded once more in his hand, as if his part in the process was already complete, and his eyes moved across the room briefly, not searching for approval, not measuring reactions, just observing, the same way he had when he first walked in. The colonel stepped forward beside the main console, his gaze moving from the screen to Mercer, then to the rest of the team. "This is what experience looks like when you cannot measure it," he said, his voice calm, carrying without effort. "You can model terrain, you can predict weather, but you cannot replace the perspective of someone who has already stood there." The words settled into the room with a clarity that did not need reinforcement. Mercer nodded once, a small, deliberate movement, then turned slightly toward Thomas, the shift subtle but unmistakable. "Sir," he said, the title coming without hesitation now. "We would not have found this without you." And there was no performance in it, no attempt to recover pride, just a simple acknowledgment of fact. Thomas gave a slight nod in return, nothing more, the exchange brief but complete, because recognition did not require elaboration. Ryan felt the tension in his chest ease, replaced by something steadier, a sense that he had just witnessed something that did not happen often, something that would stay with him long after the screens went dark. Around him, the team moved with renewed focus, refining the route, adjusting variables, aligning their work with something that finally made sense. And through it all, the Raven line remained at the center, no longer a question, no longer a forgotten marking, but the answer that had been there all along, waiting for someone who remembered how to see it. The room did not erupt in celebration. It did not fill with voices or applause. It settled into something quieter, something heavier, because what had just happened was not a victory. It was a correction, and corrections did not make noise. They changed direction. The simulation continued to run on the screen, the Raven line holding steady through every iteration, every variable now aligning with it instead of against it. And for the first time since the exercise began, the valley no longer looked like a problem. It looked like a path. Mercer stood still for a moment longer, watching it, letting the reality of it settle in fully. Then he turned toward Thomas again, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as a man acknowledging something he had not understood before. "We built everything around what we could measure," he said quietly, almost to himself, "and we missed what we could not." Thomas did not respond immediately. He simply looked at the screen once more, then back at Mercer. "You did not miss it," he said, his voice calm, steady. "You just did not know where to look." And that distinction mattered more than anything else, because it did not diminish the team, it redirected them. The colonel watched the exchange without interruption, his presence still, anchoring the room, and after a moment, he stepped forward slightly, his gaze moving from Thomas to the rest of the team. "What you saw today," he said, "is why experience is not something you replace. It is something you remember." The words were not delivered as a lesson, but as a reminder, something already known, just not always practiced. Ryan stood a little straighter, the weight in his chest now replaced by a quiet clarity, the kind that came from seeing something real, something that did not need explanation because it proved itself. Around him, the team moved with a different kind of focus now, not just executing instructions, but understanding them, each adjustment grounded in something deeper than data alone. Mercer took one last look at the map in Thomas's hand, then at the screen, then gave a single, firm nod, the kind that did not need to be seen to be understood. "We will brief the updated route in 30 minutes, he said to the room, his voice steady, clear, carrying a new weight that came not from authority alone, but from recognition. The operators moved quickly, but without the earlier tension, their motions precise, purposeful, aligned. Thomas folded the map carefully, the paper settling into its worn creases as if it had done so 1,000 times before, and he turned slightly toward the door, not waiting for acknowledgment, not expecting it. Because his role here had never been about being seen, the colonel noticed the movement immediately, stepping aside just enough to clear the path. A small gesture, but deliberate, respectful, and Thomas passed by without stopping, without looking back.